Since the end of the Second World War, and more acutely since the end of the Cold War, policymakers in Washington have often viewed the Middle East as a land of perpetual crisis, instability, and unrest, a state of affairs to be managed through diplomatic and, at times, military intervention. However, in many ways, such perceptions are neither novel nor unique to the United States. Rather, they can be traced back to the 19th century. This was a period which saw the rapid intensification of European diplomatic and military intervention into the affairs of the Ottoman Empire, which, until its destruction at the end of the First World War, dominated much of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. To the European statesmen of the era, the so-called Eastern Question, namely the civil wars, communal violence, and rebellions that shook Ottoman society at the time, were a product of the despotic barbarism of the Ottoman polity, the sick man of Europe, incapable of adapting to the modern world. Thus, in a similar vein to modern American counterparts to these statesmen, they viewed the diplomatic and military interventions into the region as necessary in order to maintain stability and order in a fractious part of the world. Such views of the Ottoman Empire have been replicated by subsequent generations of historians who have examined the Eastern Question. However, how accurate are these readings of European intervention into the Middle East and the Eastern Question more broadly? I'm Djene and Patrick.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And welcome to Talking History.
Joining us to discuss the quote-unquote Eastern Question and the rise of Western involvement in the Middle East, we are joined by Dr. Ozan Ozavci. Dr. Ozavci is an assistant professor of trans-imperial history at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and specializes in the history of the late Ottoman Empire. He is the author of several books, including his most recent, Dangerous Gifts, Imperialism, Security, and Civil Wars in the Levant, 1798 to 1864, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and is the co-leading of the Lausanne Project. Dr. Ozavci, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you, Patrick and Djene, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So let's begin with your most recent book. So in your most recent book, Dangerous Gifts, it's an effort to provide a new narrative regarding the intervention of the European powers into the affairs of the Ottoman Empire. Can you provide us with some context behind why you decided to write this book? What are the ideas that you're attempting to challenge here?
Well, the book came from a research project that was led by my colleague and friend Beatrice de Graaf at Utrecht University. She was awarded a European Research Council grant in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, a consolidated grant, and brought together a team of historians to look into what she termed European security culture. How in Europe, after the Napoleonic Wars, the major powers of the time came to have these shared perceptions of interests, threats, and corresponding practices that she called a security culture. It unfolded to secure peace in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, so that it would not be repeated, the horrors of the wars and all the misery the wars from 1792 to 1815 brought about. And in this project, my task was initially to write a book about the European powers' intervention in the 1860-61 Syrian Civil War. So that was Beatrice's idea, I must be honest with you. And the idea was to look at why and how the European powers, the five self-described great powers of the time, self-ascribed great powers of the time, Austria, Britain, France, Prussia, and Russia. Why did they intervene in the Syrian Civil War in 1860? And what happened next? That was the starting point of Dangerous Gifts. So my plan was to write a micro-historical book about European intervention in the Middle East. Thinking about why the great powers intervened, I looked at the question of, or questions of, to be more precise, by what right these five powers were intervening in the affairs of another polity, namely the Ottoman Empire. And the second question was, how did it all begin? So these two questions led me to revise Beatrice's idea considerably. And instead of writing a microhistorical book about 1860-61, visit and revisit the origins of Western armed political, diplomatic, administrative, and eventually economic and financial interventions in the Middle East. Put in other words, I decided to write a genealogy of foreign interventionism in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire. And what was supposed to be a book about 1860, 61, 62 turned into a study of nearly a century-long European armed interventions and other forms of interventions in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire. So this is where the idea came from. And I also coined, I wouldn't say coined maybe, but a little bit played with the term that she came up with, European security culture. And I came up with this new concept, trans-imperial security culture, meaning how resources, these might be militaries, armies, ammunition, navies, money, know-how, how they were mobilized from Europe to the Middle East and from Middle East back to Europe to further interests and toward threats for nearly 60, 70 years. And I believe that the period that we're looking to, where we see the first surrogate wars in the Middle East, European surrogate wars, if I may put it that way, the first slow evacuation of armies, intervening armies to gain diplomatic leverage eventually, the first Pacific naval blockades, or the emergence of these great power-mediated administrative structures in the Middle East, the first partitions, which would later become like considered as a model for several different episodes in history, including the Zionist partition of Palestine, or including the attempts to partition Eastern Anatolia between Armenians and Kurds. I just looked at these broader developments and repetitive developments and came to consider those as the birth of a trans-imperial security culture, which I like to believe formed the blueprints of many of the discursive practices in the 20th and 21st centuries. But the main idea that the book is challenging is there were studies on European interventions in the Ottoman Empire or the larger Middle East before. For example, my book starts with the 1798 French intervention of Ottoman Egypt. There were several studies about it, but there were only a handful of studies that looked at the Ottoman and Egyptian reception of these interventions, or the Lebanese reception of these interventions in a later period. What Dangerous Gifts strives to do is to offer a contrapuntal reading, meaning placing the interests and threat perceptions and practices of both European and Ottoman actors under the same analytical framework. So telling neither a Eurocentric story nor a pericentric story, if I may put it that way, but a contrapuntal, an entangled history of foreign armed interventionism. Why did the powers intervene? How were their interventions received? And why decisions during and after the interventions were ultimately made through the filter of global imperial interests of mainly European great powers.
You mentioned that you begin your book discussing Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Why was this a critical moment in the history of European intervention in the Middle East?
I would argue that this was not only the first foreign armed intervention in the Middle East. With the French invasion of Egypt in 1798, a new discursive practice also unfolded. The French authorities, in fact, these two figures, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a Corsican general in the French army back then, a very popular man, and Charles Maurice Talleyrand, a foreign minister, a conservative foreign minister. They were the two architects of the French invasion of Egypt at the time. And they came up with this practice. They framed the intervention about 205 years before George W. Bush and the neocons framed the American invasion of Iraq. They framed it as a great service to the Sultan. In a similar way, the neocons, especially the pro-intervention intellectuals like Fuad Ajami, framed the Iraqi intervention as a service to the Iraqis. In 2003, they were arguing that the Iraqis would be possibly opening their arms and thanking the Americans or the American-led, US-led coalition's invasion of Iraq. A very comparable process occurred also in 1798. This moderation or discussing moderation in aggression. 1798 also made Ottoman dependency to European great powers very evident. So after the French invaded in 1798, the Ottoman Imperial Army was immediately sent to Egypt, the land army via Syria, the navy also positioned in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. But it turned out that even though there was a reform program undergoing at the time, the Ottoman army was not capable of driving the French out of Egypt by themselves. The Ottoman Sultan of the time, Sultan Selim III, he was not eager at all to allow British troops to land in Egypt and help his armies drive the French out. Why do you think? Because he feared that if the British landed, how would he manage to drive the British out of Egypt eventually, should they decide to remain? And this was exactly what happened. In 1801, the French troops were driven out of Egypt. They were taken back to France after peace with British ships, but the British troops remained mainly in Alexandria. And despite the Treaty of Amiens, they didn't leave. Not at least before they established a system in Egypt that the Ottoman authorities did not really prefer in the first place. In fact, the Ottoman armies, as the Ottoman, Grand Admiral, Captain Derya, the Ottomans would put it, as he reported back to Istanbul in 1802, the two armies, the British and Ottoman armies, came to a position of war because the British were not leaving and they were forcing the Ottomans to act in a certain way. The details are very complex. The fact that the Ottomans realized their dependency to European great powers also meant that, or also signaled the fact that the Ottoman Empire was now what social scientists call an ontological insecurity, or they were suffering a syndrome or a paradox, because they were now dependent on the support of those great powers, which were, in the first place, the very threat to the territorial integrity, if not the existence of the Ottoman Empire. So this episode, the French invasion of Egypt, made it clear, the Napoleonic Wars made it quite clear to the Ottomans that things had changed.
So basically, kind of to sum up the point, this Napoleonic intervention into Egypt basically exposes this kind of contradictory crisis that is taking place in the Ottoman Empire, where the Ottomans rightly fear European intervention, but because of the weakness of their state, they're dependent on playing off the various European powers against one another in order to maintain their order. But, replacing one European power, France, with another European power, Britain, ends up putting them back to square one because they again have foreign troops that they need to get rid of. And a kind of second point of this is that this marked as you say, kind of a new phase in political discourse regarding intervention into the Middle East. I mean, obviously, historically, there have been wars between the Ottomans and the European powers, but at this point, instead of framing the war as being a fight between, let's say, Christianity and Islam, the French are presenting this intervention as beneficial to the people of Egypt, and you would kind of draw a lineage between that kind of discourse and, for example, the discourse surrounding the Iraq War. Would that be a fair summation of why this is a critical point?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, in fact, I would also add an interesting fact here, a fun fact, if you like. When the French landed in Egypt, they immediately started this propaganda, and they started to release these rumors, one of which was the fact that Napoleon Bonaparte was actually Muslim, and he became a Muslim and took the name Ali, or originally his name was Ali Bonaparte. So there were these kind of attempts to show or to frame the intervention as a friendly one, though you would see that on the ground the situation was very different, because both Alexandria and Cairo were pillaged, and you would see mass killings, rapes, and all types of violence and horrendous stories happening soon after the French invasion and the Egyptian resistance.
So we have basically a situation during the Napoleonic era where Britain and France are fighting a kind of proxy war in Egypt. But of course, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, after the defeat of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna, we have, the emergence of the Concert of Europe, the idea of a kind of collective security in the post-Napoleonic era, and shifts in geopolitics. And one interesting example of this, which has relevance to the case of European intervention into the Ottoman Empire, is the old enemies, Britain and France, who had competed in Egypt. They, in fact, cooperate during the Greek War of Independence during the 1820s. How can we understand the rationale behind this intervention and its eventual outcome, which was the creation of a Greek nation state on territories formerly controlled by the Ottoman Empire?
Well, in standard textbooks, the great powers' intervention in the Greek Revolution, and by great powers, I mean Britain, France, and Russia, the triple powers intervention is usually considered as one of the first humanitarian interventions in history. The powers intervened mainly because, especially from 1822 onward, at 22 onward, 22, you would see these mass massacres, massive episodes of killings, rapes, plunders in different parts of Greece, in Aegean Islands, in Corfu, also in Western Anatolia, in Smyrna, or in Turkish Izmir, and in Ayvalık, which created this hysteria in Europe, especially the Philhellenes, and especially religious groups. They started to, the power of public opinion affected these governments, Britain, France, and Russia, and they eventually intervened. So this is the mainstream narrative, or what you can find in standard textbooks. But in reality, the situation was a bit more complex, of course, as usually was the case in Euro-Ottoman relations back then. And one way to disentangle this complexity at the time is to look at what the Ottomans were thinking about the Greek uprising and how they responded to it. Yes, they appealed to violence, mass violence. Sultan Mahmud II realized that even the dragoman of the Imperial Council, a Greek figure, was part of the revolution, and he feared that the Greek Revolution was not about Greek independence or about Greek liberal nationalist aspirations. He never understood that, nor any other Ottoman ministers, I would say. But he feared that this was a Russian ploy. There were these lingering disputes between the Ottoman Empire and Russia since at least 1812, since the 1806-1812 Russo-Ottoman came to an end. With the Treaty of Bucharest, the 1806-12 war was terminated, but neither the Ottomans nor the Russians were entirely happy with their clauses. Especially the Ottomans were unhappy with the clauses on the Caucasus, about the Caucasus border, and the Russians were unhappy with the Ottoman treatment of the Serbians, who had been granted a degree of autonomy with the 1812 Treaty of Bucharest, but the Ottomans had violated it. And in the same way, the Russians had violated the border arrangement in the Caucasus and in Bessarabia also. And according to Sultan Mahmud II, Russians were looking for an opportune moment to act again, mobilize their armies, and restart war with the Ottomans and get what they want. And the Sultan was fearing that this could be Constantinople because in 1807, at Tilsit, Napoleon Bonaparte and Tsar Alexander had made these concrete plans of partitioning the Ottoman Empire. And back then, Tsar had claimed Constantinople, as they would put it, or the Ottomans would call it Istanbul. So he believed that also, given the fact that Alexandros Hypsilantis, the leader of the Greek Revolution in the first place, was an officer in the Russian army, the fact that Russian Foreign Minister Antonios Kapodistrias was originally Greek and had visited Corfu only months before the Greek Revolution had begun, and he eventually became the first leader of the autonomous Greece in 1828. And also the intelligence that the Ottoman imperial elites had gathered. They were all pointing to the fact that Russians were involved in this revolution. And you would see these unprecedented mobilization of Ottoman army and navy, which was stationed in Istanbul, because they were expecting a Russian attack while the Ottoman armies were fighting the Greek revolutionaries in the Morea and different parts of Greece and Balkans. But what happened eventually? Well, they constantly accused the Russians, they blockaded Russian trade, and they antagonized Tsar Alexander to an extent that, of course, coupled with all those mass violence taking place against the Greek revolutionaries and civilian populations, though I must note that the Greek revolutionaries were also engaged in mass violence, killing large amounts of both Muslims and Jews in Morea. But coupled with all these dynamics, in 1824, Russia was the first to decide to intervene in the Greek Revolution, mediate between the revolutionaries and the Ottomans, and potentially establish a Greek autonomous state. But this was not a scenario that the British and eventually the French would like to accept, because this autonomous Greece could turn into a satellite republic or kingdom of Russia, much the same, as it had happened in the Crimea more recently, and previously as well in 1774. In short, what actually happened was the Russians were the first to intervene, and then the British didn't want Russia to intervene unilaterally. They joined the intervention. But in 1826, Ottomans and Russians made an agreement, and they resolved their disputes in the Caucasus and the Balkans in favor of Russia, because the Russians promised the Ottomans that the Greek cause, the Greek revolution, would drop out of agenda of the great powers if the Ottomans accepted Russian terms. But then the Greek issue did not drop off European agenda, because this time the Philhellenes were really pressuring the governments in Britain, in London and St. Petersburg. And eventually France also joined, because they didn't really want Britain and Russia to act on their own, and they wanted to reclaim their great power status, which had been jeopardized during the Napoleonic Wars. So as a result, we see this tripartite intervention on the part of Britain, France, and Russia. They initially wanted to mediate between the Greeks and Ottomans and establish an autonomous Greek state. But then after the Navarina incident and after the Ottomans declared war on Russia in 1828-29 and were defeated and humiliated in the battleground, as well as during the 1829 Treaty of Edirne, they had to accept Greek independence.
Dr. Ozavci, thank you very much for your time. That's all we have time for this month on Talking History on KSMU. However, if you would like to hear more from our conversation with Dr. Ozavci, be sure to check out our podcast, Talking History Extra, at ksmu.org, as well as everywhere you get your podcasts. Welcome to Talking History Extra, where we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Ozavci. Your book continues by examining both the war between Mehmet Ali of Egypt and the Ottoman central government, as well as its aftermath, in particular the civil war in Lebanon in the 1860s. How do you understand the role of the great powers in these conflicts?
But there's a fascinating story here. A story that revolves around two soldiers that were serving the Ottoman Imperial Army in the year 1800, when they went to Egypt to fight against the French. One of them was named Husrev, who was originally a slave from the Caucasus, brought to Istanbul when he was a young boy and educated at the palace school, and then became a steward of the Grand Admiral when he was in Egypt in 1800. And the other one was this swashbuckling gangster from Kavala, a man of Albanian origin with the name of Mehmet Ali. They both end up in Egypt. One came from Istanbul, the other from Kavala. And then after the war, after the Ottoman Imperial Army left Egypt, the two remain. Husrev becomes the governor of Egypt for a short while, and Mehmet Ali serves under Husrev, but then they turn against one another. When they were in the early 30s, they were both born in 1769, though there are some disputes that Mehmet Ali might have been born in 1770. Why am I telling you this? Because these two young men in their early 30s in Egypt in 1800s, 30 years later, 35 years later, even 40 years later, they became the most powerful two men in the Ottoman world. And their fighting, their hostility in the Egypt of 1800s affect the history of the entire Ottoman Empire, and I would argue the world, the history of the world. Because by the time we reach 1830s, Husrev becomes Serasker, which is equivalent of Ottoman Minister of War, and eventually he becomes the Grand Vizier. And Mehmet Ali emerges as the Pasha of Egypt and turns Egypt into this most powerful militarily and economically most powerful entity in the Ottoman world.
Just to give a little bit of context for our listeners, at this point, the Ottoman Empire is engaging in a process of administrative centralization, bringing disparate provinces under the authority of the central government. But one area that this doesn't work is in Egypt, where Egypt, under Mehmet Ali, who has become the governor of Egypt at this point, it's technically part of the Ottoman Empire. On paper, it's part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice, it's functionally an independent state with its own military, its own governmental structures, and its own economic policies. And there's a kind of brewing tension and conflict because you have a kind of state within a state in the Ottoman Empire. Would you say that's a kind of fair assessment of the geopolitical situation we're talking about here?
The state within a state part, yes, but the political centralization That was an on and off process, but it would gain traction from the late 1830s onwards towards the end of the conflict between Nusra and Mehmed Ali. So that came a little bit later, I would argue that. So they became the most powerful two figures in the Ottoman world, and the Ottoman world was engaged in a civil war. And Mehmed Ali was supported by the French because they had this vested interest. Several French officers that had remained unemployed after the Napoleonic Wars had been employed by Mehmed Ali and helped modernize Egyptian army under Mehmed Ali's rule. And the Ottoman imperial government in Istanbul, where Hüsrev was a very prominent and powerful figure, in fact, the most powerful figure, was supported by Britain. And in the 1830s, the two armies, the imperial armies of the Ottoman Empire and Egyptian armies, fought several battles. And from all of these battles, the Egyptian army emerged victorious. So the hostility between two men affected Ottoman history very dramatically because right at that point, Ottoman agents in Europe were trying to gain the support of other European powers and trying to undermine French support to Egypt, for example, in 1830s. What they would see in France, in Paris especially, and among the Saint-Simonians, liberals, was this Egyptian extravaganza. They were all considering these French liberal Saint-Simonians, they were all considering Mehmed Ali as this Napoleon of the East, as the civilizer of Asia and the Eastern world. And Ottoman agents were extremely uncomfortable and frustrated. And right at that point, they would adopt this idea of civilization into Ottoman imperial lexicon, and they would start this Tanzimat era, the reform era, with which we would see the centralization of the Ottoman government. Vadevio. The declaration of the Tanzimat era came with the Gülhane Edict on the 3rd of November, 1839. But it could not be implemented immediately. But the idea was basically to depict the Ottoman Empire, and especially Istanbul, as the civilized face of the East, to bring in foreign intervention in support of the Ottoman imperial state and against Egypt. European powers did not intervene merely because of their greed and their quest for those 4Gs, gold, God, glory, and geopolitics. There were also pull factors of interventionism, such as the existing conflicts among the Ottoman elites and different actors. And this is one of the main points that I try to make in Dangerous Gifts. The great powers or European actors did not necessarily, and as far as I could see in the period between 1790s and 1860s, in almost no instance, including the Greek Revolution, the powers were not the main agents that sparked and fanned conflicts in the Middle East. There were already existing conflicts, be it oligarchical, be it inter-elite or intra-elite, or be it sectarian. What the powers did was to intervene through a variety of reasons. Can be greed, the 4Gs, in fact 5Gs maybe, or the pull factors. And they just make the situation on the ground in the Ottoman Empire or in a particular region like Mount Lebanon even more complex, because during their intervention, especially during their collective intervention, they were not acting as one unit. They were also trying to further their individual interests. The French, the British, and the Russians, there was a competition during their cooperation. And this is a second argument I make in the book. The powers started to cooperate as of 1810s, mainly because they were competing. So cooperation and competition among the European great powers were not necessarily opposites, but there was a symbiotic relationship. In fact, cooperation was the logical completion of their competition for securing the world, securing their interests, and also, obtain as many colonies, economic, religious, political, and geostrategic interests as much as possible. And you would see a similar episode in Lebanon too. The mainstream arguments propounded by figures like Osama Makdisi, for example, professor at University of Berkeley, is that you would see sectarian conflicts in Lebanon after the Ottoman reform in 1839, and after the great powers intervened in 1840, the French and the British, they established a system whereby you would see these political institutions, modern political institutions, that were dividing people based on their sects, religious beliefs, whatever. But in my analysis, the historical sources that I saw, in fact, some of those sources were seen by other scholars as well, including Makdisi himself. My interpretation is the other way around. You would already see a simmering sectarian conflict. You would already see violence, mass violence among different groups in Lebanon, as well as in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. But the great powers only made the situation on the ground much worse.
So
because they didn't really listen to what the people, wider people, wanted to do. And that was a very complex and difficult process, as I tried to show on the third part of the book.
So in essence, we have a couple of different perspectives on the rise of sort of sectarian violence or inter-elite violence in the Ottoman Empire. One view is that, the older view, as it was, that the Ottoman Empire was a kind of society in decline, and there were all these simmering tensions that exploded within the society, and the Europeans have to come in and manage them. And then, of course, there's a kind of revisionist view which says that actually the Europeans, by intervening, are the ones that are making the problems worse. And what you're trying to say is that neither of these views are kind of sufficient, but there's a kind of dialectic between the two sides. These conflicts exist. They're not, quote unquote, created by the Europeans, but through the act of intervention in order to manage these situations, the Europeans make things worse, partly because they don't, listen to the local actors. They have their own views of things. They, see themselves as knowing better than sort of indigenous actors. But at the same time, also because cooperation, working together, is a reflection of the competition that is taking place within the between these different powers. So, for example, with the, Egypt versus the Ottoman central government in the 1830s, this conflict isn't created by the Europeans, but the Europeans are pulled into this conflict by local actors, and there's this kind of ongoing relationship. So it's not really, all the problems are in Middle Eastern society, and that Middle Easterners are somehow different from other people and more prone to violence. But at the same time, it can't be all just reduced to the evil Europeans came in and created all these problems. It's rather this ongoing relationship and the unintended consequences at times of European intervention into these conflicts.
Yes, that's very correct. In fact, I read a master's thesis recently at Oxford University that looks at the conflict in Lebanon, and I really liked the way he was phrasing, that the master's student was phrasing my intervention. You would call a post-revisionist approach on European interventions in the Ottoman Empire. And that's exactly what I was trying to do. You had this classical interpretation where they would consider Middle East as this nest of conflicts among the semi-civilized people, and then this revisionist approach where with the blame, and the Sayyidin approach, I would say, where the blame is usually put on the doors of the intervening great powers. But also there is this third approach. I think what we need to uphold and endorse more is the fact that the situation was more complex and conflict was at a deeper roots, usually originating from local dynamics, and the intervention of the great powers made it just very complex.
So, to get to a kind of final question about your book, your book is entitled Dangerous Gifts, and that's obviously a reference to the Lebanese-American academic Fuad Ajami, who you've mentioned earlier in the main part of the interview, who was one of the well-known supporters of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. And he described this invasion as being a foreigner's gift to the people of Iraq. He said that the Americans were going to go in there and, do something good for the Iraqis by getting rid of the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. So, even in picking this title, it seems that you have a kind of message for present-day politics and pointing to the 19th century as a period which can be perhaps useful to understand in order to understand our present moment and the present history of Western intervention in the Middle East. So, what would you draw from your research about intervention into the Ottoman Empire and how it's applicable to thinking about American intervention into the Middle East today?
I will just summarize this in a few words, maybe in just one sentence. Our 19th century forebearers are our contemporaries. We share with them a common culture of security, a trans-imperial culture of security, as I mentioned earlier, with which resources have been mobilized mainly from the West to the Middle East. Armies, navies, as I said before, eventually drones, you would see this remote warfare. And this trans-imperial security culture, you would see the unequal implementation of international law between or among different actors. The sovereignty of one can be breached while the others is more sacred, as we see among the great powers. They were not to interfere in each other's affairs. You would see the gradual opening up of economies, be it the Ottoman customs tariffs from the 1790s onward. They were gradually reduced by these unequal treaties that had been in place, in fact, for a longer period of time, but the Ottomans were resisting to implement it. But then, so from 1790s onward, they were forced to implement, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, especially with 1829 treaty, 1838, 61 treaties. Or today, you would see a handful of oil companies re-establishing dominant control over Iraqi oil, which they had lost in the 1970s, that they re-established dominant control from 2003 onward. And these very companies had entered Middle Eastern oil in the 1910s and 20s, actually, but after World War II, there was this nationalization policy. So you need to consider Iraqi war just as the French invasion of Egypt or the powers intervention in Greece or Ottoman Egypt civil war or Lebanese civil war, or the eventual episodes, not only in the context of these geostrategic calculations or humanitarian concerns or as a service to the locals, but they were all intersectoral processes. Financial and economic considerations informed political, bureaucratic, and geopolitical strategic decision-making processes and vice versa. And you would also need to consider what happened after interventions. Who were the net beneficiaries, the net winners of each of these interventions? How did these military complex, economic complex come into existence? And you see a pattern there. And what I tried to do in The Dangerous Gifts is to show the origins of this, how that pattern, how that these blueprints laid out in the first place, how they were formed in the first place. And what I'm realizing, or what I realized as I was writing that book, is not the fact that history repeats itself. I'm a historian. I know that the dynamics of history, actors, sectors change with context and periods. But I'm going to borrow that phrase from Christopher Clark: history rhymes. But it's not only about rhyming either. There is a continuity, because the men of 1860s were looking back to 1790s and 1810s. And then the men of 1870s, 80s, 90s, they were looking back to 1830s. In 1910s, for example, when during the Kurdish-Armenian civil war in Eastern Anatolia, or during the Armenian genocide, they were looking back to 1860 and thinking whether they should intervene like the intervention in 1860, whether they should create a new autonomous administrative structure like they did in Mount Lebanon. And then in 1920s, they would just look into these partition policies that were developed in 1840s. So there is this continuity, there is this historical memory, a security memory, if you like. But also, on the part of those in the receiving end of these interventions, there is this insecurity memory, or a paradox, a security paradox, I call it, meaning the more these self-defined, self-ascribed great powers, foreign powers, intervened in the affairs of the Middle East in the name of security, the more security was allegedly supplied, the more insecure the Middle East became. And the demand for security also increased. So the relationship between supply and demand, unlike economy, was quite different in this case. And we see pretty much the same story in most episodes of these interested or greedy interventions. I'm just being very ridiculous right now. Maybe we should just cut this out. But we see this continuity of how a region is becoming more and more unstable with almost each intervention. So there is this pattern, like the French invaded in 1798, 1801, and then you would see the emergence of a civil war among the Mamluk Beys, the Ottoman elites, and then eventually the Albanian forces. You would see several groups emerging in Iraq and finding themselves in the vortex of a civil war from 2006 onwards for about a decade, if not more, a sectarian civil war, if I may put it that way. So I think it's quite important to see that continuity, and we should really consider the way we are doing security, we are supplying security, and we are conceiving security. I think this is one of the interventions I'm trying to make in the book as well. Those foreigner gifts, however good-willed they might have been, as I say at the very end of the book, they were detrimental on the ground and dangerous, hence the title of the book.
So the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as it were.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but it might be paved with good intentions, or it might not be paved with... I mean, when reading your book, I was thinking very much of the Syrian civil war and the kind of dialectic between, internal factors behind that civil war, the older history of colonialism, how that kind of set up structures that exacerbated those problems, and then once the civil war began, how you had, Russia and the United States entering in kind of cooperation to try and resolve the crisis in the country, but at the same time making that crisis worse and also competing with each other within the framework of trying to cooperate to solve the Syrian civil war. So, I think your book is an extremely timely intervention into the discussion of Western intervention into the Middle East, what it means, how it works, how it is it's not a unidirectional process, how it's influenced by, internal factors, how elites within Middle Eastern society bring in foreign actors, and how the consequences of that playing out. And I think that far more nuanced perspective is very much lacking in, a lot of the public discussion around foreign intervention, which is usually a kind of Manichaean binary between, it's all the Middle Easterners' fault. If only the Afghan army had fought, we did our best, but they just couldn't do it and they failed us, to the opposite, which is like everything that the West does is, for this evil calculating plan to exercise, maximum harm on people. I think you provided an extremely important framework for us to look at this. But, before we end, I just want to ask a quick question. about a project that you're involved with. It's the centenary of the Treaty of Lausanne. People who are not familiar, the Treaty of Lausanne was one of the treaties that ended the First World War in the Middle East, and it was a treaty that basically recognized Turkey as a kind of sovereign state and put an end to ideas of partitioning the present-day territory of Turkey amongst Armenians, Greeks, and the various European powers. So it's an important moment in Middle Eastern history, and you've been running the Lausanne project, which is something that I've been peripherally involved in. Can you just tell us a little bit about the Lausanne project and if people are interested in learning more about the Treaty of Lausanne and the centenary of the Treaty of Lausanne, where they can go to find more information about the Lausanne project?
Yes, the Lausanne project came into existence in 2017. I co-founded it with my colleague from Southampton, Professor Jonathan Conlin. Our idea was to publish an edited volume on the Treaty of Lausanne and the Lausanne Conference of 1922-23, which was, as you say, the last of the peace settlements at the end of World War I. We argue that the World War I ended not in 1918, as the mainstream literature would have it, but in 1922-23 with the Treaty of Lausanne, with the culmination of fighting between the Greeks and the Turks. So our aim was to publish an edited volume in English, mainly because although you would find a really rich literature in the Turkish language and less so in the Greek language on Lausanne, in the English language, you would have only one monograph, and that was looking merely at the strategic calculations of Britain and Turkey during the conference, a book written by Sevtap Demirci, a very fine book otherwise. But what we were thinking of Lausanne, or we were considering Lausanne as a more complex process that was not only about geostrategic calculations, but as I mentioned before, with these diverse intersectoral factors feeding into peacemaking process, and we wanted to unpack that. And we wanted to look at not only the interest and threat perceptions of those actors that were sitting at the negotiating table, but also those that were not involved in the negotiation processes, but they were still trying to lobby, that were still trying to affect the outcome of peace, like the Arab groups, the Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Armenians, less so Kurds, or other groups. So the aim of the project was basically to write a new history of a treaty which was quite important for both Middle Eastern and world history, again, I would say, and mainly because you would see the emergence of the United States and Soviet Union for the first time on the other sides of the table, but also you would see the emergence of big oil in the Middle East and Standard Oil, and it's different, how they call it, like this branches?
Subsidiaries.
Yeah, say it again?
Subsidiaries.
Yes, it's different subsidiaries like the Jersey Oil that would emerge and claim about 25% of Middle Eastern oil during and after Lausanne. But then you had this pandemic that came into, that kind of changed everything for us. So we decided to create an online forum among the different participants of the edited volume. We wanted to do a conference in Paris, but because of the pandemic, it had to be postponed. So we decided to publish some blogs and podcasts about the findings of different contributors to the edited volume. But then it went beyond what we conceived in the first place. The website became very popular very quickly, thanks to the work of also our assistant back then, Bryony Harris, who was an intern at Utrecht University. She did a marvelous job in designing the website together with my colleague Jonathan Conlin. And then we started to receive these submissions for publishing blogs and being part of a podcast. And yeah, it's now being followed almost all over the world. Our podcast is podcasts are downloaded thousands of times, and we are very happy about it. And we went beyond the edited volume, so we have this blog post podcast, but we also try to make Lausanne, this complex story, more accessible to a general audience. Also, not only through blog posts and podcasts, but also through a graphic novel. My colleagues Jonathan Conlin and Julia Säcklehner and I co-authored a graphic novel about Lausanne, two protagonists of this famous Shadow of Theater in the Middle East, Karagöz and Hacivat, or known in Greece as Karagözis. They run away from their puppeteer one day through a magical moment. I can't tell how that happens so as not to spoil. But then they end up in Lausanne. One of them is trying to make it rich, and the other is trying to make the Middle East more independent from Western interference. We try to tell a fun, childlike, but not a childish story in that graphic novel. We also have a teacher's package where we brought together Greek and Turkish high school teachers to discuss how they teach Lausanne and how we can teach it in a less nationalistic, or if possible non-nationalistic way, and in a more inclusive and through more peaceful narratives. The teachers came together, we developed a teaching package, and it will soon be available for high school teachers in on our websites in Turkish, Greek, and English. It will be free to download, and along with that, we have also helped organize a number of exhibitions, and we have some other programs. So the project is going well. If you're interested, I'm telling this to the audience, check out the lausanneproject.com. And if you would like to, share your thoughts in the form of a blog post or a podcast, just get in touch with us.
And I'll put a link in the description to the podcast so that people listening can,
Thank you.
Can take a look.
One final question. One thing we ask all of our guests for is some book recommendations. What books would you recommend for people wanting to learn more about the topics we've discussed today, as well as the Ottoman Empire more generally?
Well, I would say Khaled Fahmi's studies were quite inspirational while I was writing Dangerous Gifts. His book, All the Pasha's Men, which is a semi-biographical account of how the Pasha of Egypt, Mehmed Ali, became one of the most powerful men in the Ottoman world. I would say that's quite an important work. Are you asking only about Dangerous Gifts or also the Lausanne Project as well?
Well, if you have a good one for the Lausanne Project, what would you recommend people read for that as an introduction?
Well, 3 new books came out, 3 monographs came out this year. One of them is by J. Winter. That's about Lausanne, the end of the Great War. Hans Lukas Kieser also published a book on Lausanne, When Democracy Died, but I don't entirely agree with what he claims. And Michelle Toussaint has also published a new book about Lausanne. I haven't read her book yet, but if people are interested in finding out more about Lausanne, I think that might be an interesting read too. But for the period in the long 19th century or late Ottoman history, I highly advise Virginia Aksan's works. But I would say her latest monograph, even though the period, the early 20th century is not covered that much in depth, it gives a very good overview of late 19th century or the long 19th century history of the Ottoman Empire.
But yes, Dr. Ozavci, thank you so much for spending time with us today and talking about your research and your projects. To all our listeners, you've been listening to Talking History Extra, brought to you by KSMU and Missouri State University Department of History. And that's all for this month. But be sure to join us at the same bat time, the same bat hour, for more Talking History.